This is Letter from America, presented by Dr. Stanford Mukasa. Letter from America is a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. It is a broadcast on Change Radio, an internet-based radio station of the Zimbabwean diaspora and friends from around the world. Change Radio is aimed specifically at giving Zimbabweans and friends at home and abroad news, information, and a diversity of perspectives that are not available to them in the heavily government-controlled broadcast media in the country. The opinions and views expressed in Letter from America are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily of Change Radio.
Today's topic, Part 1, Mnangagwa and ZANU PF's appalling human rights abuse and violations record. Letter from America. In Part 1 of Mnangagwa and ZANU PF's appalling human rights abuse record, Letter from America discusses the ongoing atrocities and suppression of human rights committed by the ZANU PF regime. We conclude that these abuses and atrocities will continue because they are the ZANU PF brand. While some Zimbabweans and colleagues were wishing each other a happy Christmas and prosperous New Year, a growing number were saying there is nothing to celebrate because of the continued human rights violations in Zimbabwe. However, for Zimbabweans, the year 2021 ends on a dismal but challenging note. The deaths of two human rights activists, among others, have deprived Zimbabweans of their leading champions. Dewa Mavinga, the Southern Africa Director with the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. Mavinga was known not just for his passion, commitment, and leadership on human rights, but above all, for his great heart, his kindness, and solidarity with others. Another, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of the Anglican Church in South Africa, was a fierce anti-apartheid activist. He was also very critical of the Mugabe government, especially after the Gokurahundi massacres and the rampant corruption in the ZANU PF regime. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe a caricature of an African leader. In 2008, the late President Nelson Mandela was also highly critical of Mugabe as the cause of the political and humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe. Mandela said Zimbabwe was suffering due to a tragic failure of leadership. In 1999, the late Mugabe said Gukurahundi was a moment of madness. He said this only once. He never said it before or after. He never offered any relief for the victims of Gukurahundi. Yet that same year, in 1999, Mugabe was forced by the war veterans to give them an unbudgeted cash handout amounting to $50,000 for each war veteran. The government also paid school fees and medical expenses for war veterans and their families. The contrast and double standards could not be more astounding. Mugabe's butcher's helper, President Mnangagwa, when given the opportunity to apologize for Gukurahundi in 2018 at a meeting in Davos, Switzerland, he simply said, "Let bygones be bygones." The fact that Mnangagwa has done nothing to bring relief to the victims of Gukurahundi shows very clearly that he and ZANU PF intend to do absolutely nothing. On January 5, 2018, the National Peace and Reconciliation Act was signed by President Emmerson Mnangagwa, bringing into operation the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which was established in 2016. But this was 5 years after the commission had been established. This commission was established under the Zimbabwe Constitution of 2013. It has a lifespan of 10 years. It will expire in 2023, 2 years from now. The mission of this commission cannot be extended. When it was set up by Mugabe, the Peace Commission did not have a budget. It did not have offices. It did not have any vehicles. It did not have a chairman or a convener. It was only about 2 years ago that some very limited resources were allocated to it. A review of the commission 2 years ago showed that the Zimbabwe National Peace and Reconciliation Commission does not have enough political and legal power to address conflicts rooted in the injustices faced by the people of Zimbabwe. And this situation still exists today. The peace commissioners have been roaming around the country, especially Matabeleland, taking evidence. But what new information will come from such evidence 40 years after the Gukurahundi atrocities? Information about what happened during Gukurahundi has already been collected by the Chihambakwe Commission, the Catholic Peace and Justice Commission, human rights organizations, international news media reports. Information from these sources are a lot more credible, or reports from these sources are a lot more credible because the individuals who gave evidence were eyewitnesses and victims of Gukurahundi. Now, today, most of these are no longer alive, or memories are difficult to hold given the age of the surviving victims. The Chihambakwe Commission of Inquiry was a truth commission set up by government to investigate into the Matabeleland disturbances from 1983 to 1984. The report from the inquiry was never made public by the government, and therefore the findings of the Commission's official report are unknown. However, according to the late Dumiso Dabengwa, the former leader of the ZIPRA ex-combatants, the Commission's report completely exonerated ZAPU from involvement into the dissident problem in Matabeleland. The report also implicated ZANU's complicity in this dissident problem. To counter the government's silence on the Chihambakwe report, two Zimbabwean human rights organizations, the Legal Resources Foundation and the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, produced a report entitled Breaking the Silence, Building True Peace in 1997. The report was produced independently from the Chihambakwe Commission of Inquiry, and it was an attempt of civil society to interrupt the state-sanctioned silence around the events in the early 1980s. The unofficial report called upon a variety of sources, such as statements from victims, records from missionaries, journalists and lawyers, interviews, documents from Amnesty International and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, or evidence from graves and mine shafts. And you can see here that this commission report was very comprehensive indeed. Following the Unity Accord between ZANU and ZAPU in 1987, Mugabe gave an amnesty to dissidents, collaborators, and members of the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU. It is reported, however, that only about 100 so-called dissidents turned up for the amnesty. However, as a result of growing pressure to prosecute members of the 5th Brigade, as well as other ZANU militia thugs who had committed unspeakable atrocities against innocent civilians, another amnesty was granted in 1990. The 1990 General Amnesty included the state's uniformed forces, who had been responsible for Gukurahundi in Matabeleland and Midland provinces in Zimbabwe from 1982 to 1987. Yet another amnesty in 2000 benefited ZANU PF supporters and militia thugs who were implicated in unleashing politically violent, motivated violence, arson, the burning of homes, the intimidation of opposition supporters. This 2000 amnesty was a clear evidence that Mugabe and ZANU PF were shielding human rights violators from prosecution. The level and extent of human rights abuse by the Mnangagwa and ZANU PF government is very disconcerting, to say the least. Mnangagwa and ZANU PF have engaged with amazing impunity in politically motivated violence against mainly MDC alliance supporters, unrestrained corruption, and used the armed police to harass and disrupt peaceful gatherings for opposition supporters. The Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, in their statement to commemorate Africa Human Rights Day, noted that Zimbabwe continued and continues to violate human rights. Yet Zimbabwe is a signatory to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which specifically requires member states to observe and respect human rights. These rights are also enshrined in the Constitution of Zimbabwe of 2013. But the problem is many of the provisions of the Constitution have not been coded into the Zimbabwean law. The Mnangagwa and ZANU PF regime are dragging their feet on the implementation of these human rights protocols or clauses. The reason is very simple. Mnangagwa and ZANU PF rely on violence and corruption to stay in power. Just a few days ago, and in an angry outburst about candidates for ZANU PF provincial elections, one woman supporter of ZANU PF claimed in public that they rigged the 2018 elections by voting multiple times using different IDs. It is a well-known fact that ZANU PF has never won any elections since 2000. ZANU PF is extremely unpopular because it has not brought the promised human socio-economic development to the people. The vast majority of the country's infrastructure was developed during the Ian Smith regime, and that was before independence. For many rural citizens, life is at a standstill. Poverty is endemic. Hospitals in rural areas are in a pathetic state. In some schools, students learn under trees or in dilapidated conditions. Roads are a death trap in most of these areas. About 10 years ago, some international economists say the post-colonial Zimbabwe had economically regressed to 1953. What they meant was simply that the standards of living for mainly rural Zimbabweans and urban poor was no better than life in 1953, when Zimbabwe was called Southern Rhodesia. Most Zimbabweans see their deteriorating conditions worsening daily. They see it because they experience these deteriorating conditions. And they know who is responsible for this parlous, despicable situation. It does not take a rocket scientist to engage in a simple logic that Zimbabweans would never vote for the same Mnangagwa and ZANU PF that has brought such poverty, misery, and desecration of their basic human rights. How can you vote for your oppressor? How can you vote for somebody who has brought so much misery? ZANU and Mnangagwa know this very well. Therefore, they are trying to block the opposition parties from campaigning. But most of all, Mnangagwa and ZANU PF now have a system in place to rig elections. This system has been fine-tuned over many years. Mnangagwa and ZANU PF's policy on elections is simply, it is enough that people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything. Mnangagwa and ZANU PF survival depends on politically motivated violence, corruption, and rigging elections. But over and above, ZANU PF now relies almost 100% on the protection from the military. Mugabe was once overheard saying, "Tingawe tiri kupi kusina masoja." Where would we be if it was not for the military? One political scientist described ZANU PF as an empty shell without any substance and without any support from the Zimbabweans. A number of years ago, the ZANU PF Secretary for Administration bemoaned that no one was buying ZANU PF membership cards and that these cards were gathering dust at some abandoned warehouse. Zimbabwe has since independence 40 years ago been run by securocrats. Securocrats are military and police officers who have the power to influence and control government policy. In Zimbabwe, the securocrats are the Joint Operations Command. Joint Operations Command operates in liaison with the ZANU PF Politburo, a 49-member body that formulates and decides policy for the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU PF. The notion of a Politburo was borrowed from the Soviet Union. Ironically, today's Russia ended the Politburo in 1991 upon the breakup of the Soviet Union. Russians no longer use Politburo anymore. The late President Robert Mugabe, in a slip of the tongue, admitted that in 2008 elections, MDCT, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, won 75% of the votes to ZANU PF's less than 30%. Mugabe's staff immediately corrected him and corrected in courts. They knew he had let the cat out of the bag. So one can say at this moment, the cat was out of the bag. Another professor wrote a book giving graphic details about how ZANU PF rigged the 2018 elections. A lot of information is beginning to emerge. It has been emerging since 2018, how ZANU PF rigged the elections. According to other sources and tabulations, the winner of the 2018 presidential elections was MDC Alliance President Nelson Chamisa, who reportedly polled 2.6 million votes to Mnangagwa's 2.1 million. But these numbers were reversed, giving the victory to Mnangagwa. The full statement from the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights reads as follows. As Zimbabwe joined the rest of the continent on this Africa Human Rights Day, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights is alarmed by recent incidents of politically motivated violence experienced by opposition political party MDC Alliance members during their community citizens conversation interface. Also disturbing are the reported attempts on the MDC Alliance party leader's life, Advocate Nelson Chamisa. The lawyers' organization makes recommendations. On this Africa Human Rights Day, the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights urges the government to 1. Implement all outstanding recommendations that have been made by the African Commission on Human Rights in its concluding observations following the submission of the previous state reports. 2. Implement recommendations by the African Commission on Human Rights situation in the Republic of Zimbabwe. 3. Ratify the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the establishment of the African Court of Human and People's Rights. 4. Uphold political and civil rights without discrimination and arrest and prosecute perpetrators of political violence. This concludes today's letter from America. In part 2 of Mnangagwa and ZANU PF appalling human rights abuse record, Letter from America will continue the narrative on the ongoing atrocities and suppression of human rights committed by the ZANU PF regime.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe.